governments in Belgrade and Pristina are said to be doing everything to fight poverty and inequality, but somehow resources are limited, and the social poverty, the social policies have many flaws. Today, before we start the discussion, and the discussion will be between Professor Jelena Žarković of the Faculty of Economics with the Belgrade University, and Artan Mustafa, professor at the Faculty of Political Science, University for Business and Technology in Pristina. Before we give the floor to them, I would like to welcome also Max Brendle, Director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung office in Belgrade. Max, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ljubica. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's also my pleasure to welcome you to our event today on the challenges of poverty and inequality in Serbia and Kosovo. My name is Max Brendle. I'm director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung office in Belgrade. Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is a German political foundation affiliated with the Social Democrats in Germany, and we have offices all over the region, here in Belgrade, where we are today, and also in Pristina, where our guest from Pristina is. And we have this Zoom online event and a series of events between our offices in Pristina and Belgrade in order to address relevant issues to the population and to the citizens in these communities. Beyond the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, which seems so hard to get moving again and to achieve results, there are lots of issues that concern the people in both communities. And we want to address them in this series. Issues on feminism, on green economy, on ecology, on environmental policy, and today on inequality and poverty. And a sheer look at the numbers already reveals that this is a relevant topic. Roughly 1/4 of the population is in danger of poverty both in Serbia and in Kosovo. And we have already heard that this has many aspects, and I'm looking forward to our debate with experts, both from Pristina and from Belgrade, in this debate today, how to address this issue, what can be done, and what we can also do together. And as Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, we hope to achieve a more interesting and informed debate about these topics, which are close to our heart and our values as social democrats. But we would also like to make a contribution to the dialogue and exchange of opinions and positions between Belgrade and Pristina with this series of events. So for this, I hand back to our moderator, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, very much. I'm looking forward to hearing from Professor Žarković and Mustafa more about this topic. Can I, Jelena, invite you to start? If you were to describe the situation in Serbia, what would you say? These are really disturbing data that Max referred to about the 1/4 of the population living at risk of poverty.
Yes, if we look at the data, and there are comparable data for Kosovo and Serbia, that is European Union Serbian income and living conditions. The latest one was published, just before the pandemic. And as you said, like 1/4 of population is below the poverty line in Serbia. In Kosovo, it's some 4 percentage points more, but so more or less the same. And there are some, and with the pandemic, of course, we expect situation in terms of the poverty. I was looking at some of the World Bank's projection. There is a difference because in Serbia we had this large government support program for both for the private sector and for the citizens. In terms, it was in the end 15% of the GDP. So as the World Bank explains in their spring report, it in fact acted as a buffer, so to prevent this large drop in the living standards. and they are expecting that the poverty rate will stay more or less the same. In Kosovo, on the other hand, they expect a rise in poverty rate for 4 percentage points. So, and I hope that today with Artan we are going to discuss, there are many similarities in our labor markets, and I think that's quite important for, you know, the overall poverty rate, but still there are also some differences. I hope we will speak both about the labor market and also you said at the beginning that the resources are limited. Well, that depends. It's really, I mean, the decision of the government, how much it plans to spend on certain social benefits. There as well, both societies spend, I think, not too much on these programs that are really targeted towards the poorest population. In Serbia, we spend more on pensions, but they also have a very large impact on poverty reductions. On the other hand, in Kosovo, maybe Artan will mention that, and I've seen that in one of the World Bank's report, that there are also a large spending for war veterans, and they're also struggling with that because they're not necessarily a poor population, but that's a political question. So, okay, I open up now many topics for Artan, okay. So let's see.
Now we go to Pristina. Artan, how would you describe the situation with from 27 with the 4% more projected by the World Bank, there will be 30% over 30% of people in Kosovo living at the risk of poverty. What can you say about that?
Okay, so I will come back to this the projection of the World Bank, but I will just start by giving a short background on poverty and inequality in Kosovo, because as Max said at the beginning, there are various dimensions. The national poverty is measured and was measured by World Bank and Kosovo Agency of Statistics together, and based on consumption. And these indicators over years tended to create an impression that the poverty realities are improving. Less and less parts of society are poorer from that perspective. But as Jelena said, if we look at the poverty from the relative perspective based on EU Silk data now, Kosovo is the poorest country of the region when it comes to income poverty. And it is by far the poorest country in Europe when you look at it from a multidimensional perspective, this at risk of poverty rate and social exclusion, which measures income poverty, deprivation, and low intensity of work. So, and then there is another dimension, looking at it from a very long historical perspective. Since socialism, there is considerably less poverty now after the war, especially nowadays, than there was in socialism. But inequality was very high in socialism. What is a different outcome compared to the rest of the region, and is deepening. So social policy, of course, or the public policy in general, has been improving in the sense that its capacity to reduce poverty, both compared to socialism, especially, has been improved. But then, in difference to Serbia, which has maintained a lot of institutions from socialism, Kosovo, owing mostly to the unprecedented influence of international organizations, has moved with a very different setup of institutions which provided better protection for poverty. But then over time, these institutions are not designed to challenge inequality. So they are also not updated, especially the programs, direct programs that are aimed to offer poverty protection, for example, social assistance or universal basic pensions and so on, which are very good programs on protecting poverty, but they have not been updated in terms of eligibility criteria since the conditions of after war. And for that reason, the average income in the market has improved, and other transfers that are particularistic, as Elena mentioned earlier, issue better payments. So these poverty programs, they don't, since they are not so updated, their potential to reduce poverty and control it has been declining. There are discussions nowadays. I have seen that in the program of the new government, they have pre-announced that they will change different criteria when it comes to accessibility of the poverty protection program, and also some reforms in the pension system. But there were important developments during the COVID-19 pandemic, and while the World Bank has
before we move to COVID, and that's important. I would like to ask, fully respecting that you are university teachers, but I would like to ask you, when somebody who comes from abroad goes to the center of Belgrade and of Pristina. The streets are very vibrant, and it may appear that the situation is better than the situation that you would expect in a country where 30% or 25% of people live at the risk of poverty. So there is this data moment, and there is the real life. How is it? Why do we appear to do better than we actually are? Is it because a significant amount of money is coming from abroad? People are sending money to their relatives. How do people actually live and survive in spite of these data that are really not encouraging?
Yes, well, I was also asking myself when I was looking more, in the data comparing Kosovo and Serbia. So, in fact, there is not so large difference in terms of the poverty rate, but still looking only at the labor market indicators, in fact, there are large differences. And also, if you look at the demographics, so Kosovo society is very young, which is good. So people are, young people are coming to the working age population, but then they don't have, so probability of finding a job is very low, so 50% of the young people are unemployed. And what is similar in both societies is that there are large immigration, so overall this Western Balkan region is the region of immigration, and as you mentioned, so large, in fact, inflow of remittances. In case of Kosovo, that is much larger, like almost 13% of the GDP. In Serbia, it's lower, like 6, 7, depends on the measurement. And I think that's also quite important. So if we were discussing, so measuring poverty in terms of the income, where is that income coming? If it is not coming from a job, if many people are unemployed, if it is not coming from the social protection system, and it's not, so our social protection system are quite limited, then these remittances are in fact quite important. And of course, what you said, if you visit the capital, Pristina or Belgrade, the situation is different from some rural places where, of course, the poverty is higher. And also one similar thing in both societies is that many people are working for the state. So public sector employment is quite high. In Serbia it's 30%, and in Kosovo it's even more than 50%.
And certain important percentage works in what we call gray economy.
And also, yeah,
so
that's
it's difficult to actually,
of course, it's even
measure.
Yeah, it's 20% of people working in informal economy in Serbia, and even 35 in Kosovo, which, if we are now talking about the poverty, it will affect their poverty, you know, in older age, because they are not contributing to the system. And Artan just mentioned, so this large influence of international organizations in this social policy field and economic policy field in Kosovo, they have quite different pension system. There is this basic pension for everybody, which is really good. Something like that does not exist in Serbia. So we have like 200,000 people without any income, you know, and in this pensionable age. But at the same time, they have this private pension system, which is, and we were talking, Artan and I, recently about that. So what would be because, you know, for countries that don't have very developed financial markets, that could be a problem. Croatia doesn't have very good experience with this private system of pensions, but in Kosovo it's a bit different. Maybe Artan can talk more about that.
Artan, can you just
jump in maybe because Jelena mentioned a lot of factors that I really agree with. The percentage of workers in the public sector, just for viewers, it should be a little bit smaller, about 25, maximum 30%, but the rest, I agree with all what Jelena described. I would just add that, especially from a longer perspective, still the politics and the public policy has made differences, has made some differences in the income structure. For example, if we see this is relevant for Kosovo because the conditions in socialism especially were a little bit different from, for example, Serbia or especially Slovenia. So the rural population has enjoyed better income from work and has enjoyed also more share of the income from transfers and so on. So also public policy and work resources have improved, have contributed to an improvement of situation for the rural population, especially, which then translates to smaller poverty. If we look at poverty from an absolute perspective, conditions have improved. Even the labor in longer terms, the labor force is bigger, the employment rate is higher, and so on and so on. But if we look at the poverty from a relational perspective, the inequalities are important, and this is about in what kind of society you want to live. This relates directly with your question. So for us, the important question is who is really enjoying life and is happier, as you described. These EU Silk data that we were mentioning before really are especially concerned with what is happening with these people living in the smaller deciles, in the poorer parts of population, and especially in Kosovo, but in Serbia as well. These people are left behind. And Jelena mentioned something very important. Even though we have very different policy designs in Kosovo and Serbia since 2000, from another perspective, especially from an intergenerational perspective, both countries coming from different ways are concentrated on old age population. Not so much. Kosovo, for example, spends almost close to zero on child population. Most of the childcare services are private or expected to be provided in the private sector, and so on and so on. And these are very important for what kind of societies we are creating. Sweden, for example, when it decided to move towards a more social democratic society in the early 1960s was a poorer society than Kosovo for almost $2,000, so almost 50%. So it's not so much about resources necessarily, to come back to an earlier point that was mentioned, but it's also what kind of society we want to live and who is shaping it. And an important reason why we have this setup of policy in Kosovo is the fact that not only international organizations, but also the main political parties that have been in power have all, during the past 2 decades, have had right-leaning ideology, and they have dominated the parliament. It's only now that we have seeing a little bit movement towards the left, and then we see this reflection of ideology both during the pandemic and also in recent, more contentful articulations towards future reforms. Maybe I'll come back because this is a very big question, and there are a lot of factors really that maybe we have left.
This is an important issue of.
I just wanted to stress what Artan said. I think it's really very important that the poverty is outcome of certain policies. So we choose some policies. It's not that poverty is our destiny, you know. Well, he mentioned Sweden in the 60s, but we don't have to go that far. So you look at the Slovenia. I'm now at the moment working on some paper comparing Slovenia, Croatia and Serbia in terms of the child poverty, because Serbia has very high child poverty and Slovenia has the lowest child poverty in Europe. And you see, so we have, and it's good because today we are also talking about Kosovo and Serbia, so all institutions from former Yugoslavia, so we had them 30 years ago, but then you see that like Slovenia managed to create even more generous social protection system, so covering now in Slovenia all children are covered with various benefits despite, you know, being poor or not poor, whereas in Serbia it's not the case.
Is it because Slovenia can afford it? Or is it just better social policy?
It's better policy. It's not really that because if you look at the data, somebody also asked me, I think one journalist recently, so, but where is the money for all that? But if we are talking about, you know, Serbia having a GDP growth rate of almost 6% this year, well, that means that there is money. And not only this year, also previous year. With Kosovo, it's the same. They had pretty good GDP growth rates, like around 4% during, so until the pandemic. So the pandemic was the only year when the GDP dropped. Artan will know better maybe for the last more than 10 years. So there is a economic progress. If there is economic progress, that means that you have money, but with, you know, certain policies, you decide how you spend that money. So it's really a policy choice.
How do you explain the failure of one after another government to create, for example, those social ID, sort of a social ID, that would, in other words, the state would know what's the social status, who is really in need of help, who should get more, who should get less, who are falsely poor, and who are people really invisible and in great need of help.
Yeah. You're talking about the social cards. That law was recently adopted in Serbia. I don't know how it is in Kosovo, but you know, I'm personally against that. That's also the policy that's been going on in the region for the last 20 or 30 years, depends, or in Kosovo during the last 10 years, and that's the policy of international institutions, mostly World Bank, and it is about the targeting. So targeting, you know, limited resources to the very poor. So, and it doesn't, so these cards are not for everybody. It's only for those that decide to apply for a certain, you know, social benefit, and it's designed to, you know, to allow the state to spend only to those in most need. But as you can see, for instance, in Serbia, just for the comparison, 250,000 people receive social benefits, so this benefit for the very poor people, but quarter of the population, so 1.5 million, are below the poverty line. So there is a large discrepancy, and I think with these social cards, when the law starts, to be applied, maybe it will be even less among these 250,000, because they will say, okay, you work, I don't know, for a couple of days in the informal economy, we see that you have a car, so let's, let's cut the benefit for you.
Artem, how does it look over there? How many people are invisible? How many people live below the poverty line and are totally forgotten or neglected by the institutions?
As you said, as you mentioned earlier in the beginning, various figures, they are correct. Almost the data say around the quarter of population lives in poverty, but really depends from what perspective you look at it. For me, the most important perspective is to look from this relational perspective. The differences in income, the differences in lifestyles that are created in Kosovo are huge. Kosovo is the most unequal society in entire Europe at the moment, and this is a result of policy. Another important, very important dimension that I think it's relevant to mention here is the fact that if you apply, and this is very relevant for the entire region, because there in Serbia, for example, as Jelena mentioned earlier, there is this pressure of coming from demographic factors. People cite this as a reason to change various aspects of policy and so on. But then Kosovo is a relevant example, because if you apply a very extreme liberal version of policy, you can have unexpected results, maybe from the viewpoint of mainstream economics. If you follow a policy of high flexible labor market, for example, if you don't tie various income social transfers with labor, that is, if you remove all social insurance, you can have probably higher employment rate, and as a result lower poverty. But the example of Kosovo has not shown it. You apply this policy, a lot of people suffer from it or are left behind. You create huge inequalities. But the employment rate doesn't grow more than 30%. So really, the expectation of radical mainstream liberal ideas are not fulfilled. And we have seen also during the COVID-19 pandemic that the absence of these social insurance institutions, like, for example, health insurance and unemployment insurance, could be almost could produce almost catastrophic results in times of economic shocks. Because when public policy wanted to offer, for example, protection to the unemployed, in an absence of specialized institutions that would have the data, knowledge, and infrastructure to react, Kosovo could not deliver the protection efficiently. Less than 1,000 people in unemployment gain some protection only. Then various income aimed towards workers in the private sector that were endangered finally ended up at the employers rather than the employees. The same with health insurance. The absence of a public health insurance, the data that these organizations would have meant that many people had really to rely to spend a lot from their pockets during the crisis, and only the municipality of Pristina, which again it has some leadership that comes from left wing, has come up with some transfers to complement private expenditure during the pandemic. But the rest of municipalities, people either had to wait in lines and, to cope with what was existing there, what is provided by the state, or they had to spend from their own packet. So
Did you, Artan,
yeah.
did you have the time where, well, pandemic unfortunately is not over, though we all hope that we are getting closer to its end. Has there been time for analysis on what the impact of COVID-19, of lockdowns, was on economy in Kosovo, and is now that social gap the wider? Do you have more people who are now pushed below the poverty line because of COVID?
Let's see. I mean, I haven't really seen a study of these details yet, but from the data that I have been observing and analyzing during the past months, and again, it is very important to state from what perspective you are analyzing poverty, because maybe poverty looked from the perspective that the World Bank looks, this minimum dollar poverty, consumption based, and so on. This could have been increasing because some jobs were lost. And so on, various negative impacts in the economy. But then public policy was also reacting with improving, especially these basic poverty protection programs. So I would expect normally that actually during the pandemic, poverty protection has improved from a relational perspective, and policy will learn from this very helpful learnings, because they will show that if these criteria are updated, then these parts of population that are left behind, they will be in better position. So I would not be surprised that actually poverty during the pandemic was reduced.
That's interesting. That's interesting, because we had that ongoing debate here. What happened during the pandemic, and has that notorious policy of helicopter assistance, so-called helicopter money, giving certain amount of money to every citizen above 18, has that helped?
Yes, that was also part of this government support program, so giving everybody above 18 years of age 100 euros, and then after this year 60 euros. Yes, some economists were against that measure because, as they said, it was not enough targeted, but again, these measures for private companies were also not that targeted. I mean, all three packages were more or less the same. Given that we now discuss these policy choices, and I think that maybe pandemic, I wrote one text recently about that, maybe this pandemic will be, some a turning point for a social policy, and as we said, with this universal help for every citizen in Serbia, not only in Serbia, the IMF mentioned in one report, also United States, they've been giving almost 3 times a certain amount of money. It was $100, $2,000, something like that, to every citizen that earns less than $70,000 per year. That's almost 90% of the population, and they've shown that it really helped people, to pay the basic utilities, to buy food, and it's in fact so. As I commented in that text, we are not surprised to see if you give people money that they will, feel better in terms of their finances. The surprising thing is to see how many people feel better. It's like 30–40%, meaning that large parts of the population are just, left behind with the current system. And I think that's one of the important messages that we can see from this pandemic. And I hope that this pandemic can be really some turning point for social policy creation. So to see that these benefits that have more universal character, so not targeting, not social cards, to try to look at those that are the poorest among the poor, that they can receive more support from the government. Why more universal help? Because we see that even if you have a job, that doesn't mean that you'll be, above the poverty line. Why? Because jobs are not, they're low quality, they're, just from time to time. Artan mentioned at the beginning this indicator that also comes in this data, very low working intensity. What that means? That means that, during the 1 year, you don't work more than 2–2.5 months. That's nothing. So this in-work poverty, so people having a job but they're still poor, I think that has to be recognized by the social protection system. And that's why I'm more for these more universal kinds of social benefits. So, because we have this policy of targeting for the last 20 years, and these are the results.
Now the question for both our guests. As we said, and as you described, the issue of poverty is somebody's personal issue and affects his or her personal life, but it triggers other problems, the problems like the security problems, the stability, regional stability. It opens, it triggers migrations, and if young, skilled, educated people are leaving, even not those with skills. Everybody, if everybody wants to leave certain community, how can you develop any other policy? Artan, Kosovo is known for migration, for that migration movements. It's been like that. It's also historical, but it's a recent trend as well. Are the migrations triggered by this poverty and inequality issue, or are there other factors that are important in that respect?
Well, you started and made a beautiful description, really, because as a political scientist, I like this. I think it's very important when we speak about social policy, because one of the purposes of social policy is to create capabilities that support a vibrant democratic society. For example, one of the deficiencies of this very extreme liberal policy would be that they cut a lot of options for workers to get together, to organize, and so on and so on. So this then results, for example, in a reduced political participation eventually. And in many ways, these rising inequalities that are a product of policy and the ways how job resources are distributed, income is distributed, really impact out migration. It is not only this; it's also the lack of the various gaps in the policy, especially in terms of social insurance, because for a lot of workers, the absence of health insurance, like of the type that you would see in other countries, and very low minimum income, very extremely weak protection, extremely weak protection in the labor market. They really are huge consideration for especially many young people to go and look for options through out-migration. Other factors are other factors could be relevant as well. You know, cultural pressures. Just for the youth, it could be interesting to travel sometimes. Also, the fact that these this ideology at the end of the day really supports movement towards big centers. But I would say that the main reason behind large out-migration are related to the way the political economy is organized. And we can go back again to the example of COVID-19, because we had a unique circumstance in Kosovo where during the first part of reaction to COVID-19, we had a left led government for the first time, and then it was removed and substituted with a right-wing government. We have seen very different styles in the way how COVID-19 was approached. While the left was more interested in protecting the people in poverty and employees, workers, what we have seen from the right-led government was then this going back to the ideas and policies that effectively, in the end, benefited especially the categories that are richer, employers, and so on and so on. And this has been the trend in Kosovo for the past 20 years. So really, a large reason behind huge out-migration lies here. You are right.
Jelena?
I just wanted to add that, you know, we speak here very often how large our diaspora is, and as you said, it started even in this Yugoslav period, and it didn't stop, in fact, until these days. How it can be seen as an opportunity. But I think that at least here in Serbia, Artan can comment for Kosovo, it's not used as an opportunity. Let's just discuss, like, my own institution that I'm coming from, university. I think it's still closed. It's a state university, but it's still closed for so many people, you know, with PhDs from abroad. I don't know, Artan, I guess he's also working at the private university, not public university, although he has a PhD from Austria. So I'm not sure, you know, how many people we really accept, so our people, you know, coming from abroad and that wanted to start his career over here. I'm not sure how welcome they are. I mean, from time to time there are some programs, but they're really connecting with these people, but they're still of quite limited scope. And I think that we are, the only thing that we are using from large diaspora are these remittances, you know, coming, but only on an individual basis.
But is it because our people leaving? There is a debate about that too. Is it do people leave because of poverty and inequality, or do people leave because of other better opportunities for better jobs, political stability, social stability?
I think everything is important. Like, of course, I think the most important is economic factor. That's something that is shown from many, you know, surveys, interviews with those people, students. There was a large research from the statistical office, so talking to our students, why do you plan to leave the country after your studies? Why? So the economic factor is the most important. So young people are first, they want to have a job, but not necessarily, you know, like high-paying job. And they want to work, you know, in their own profession. That's very important. And they're complaining about nepotism. So, you know, it's necessary to have certain connections to get a good job. That's what, from that research. So I think that's the most important. Other things are like, the quality of public services, like health, education, things like that, which is still rather good here in Serbia, because you have this universal, more or less, education and health system. So, so that's one thing. The other thing is why there are no because we have a large diaspora, I would expect, like looking at some other societies, to have like stronger connection with these people. And I think it's, in these days we saw with this pandemia that it's not necessary, to be in the same, not even in the same room, to work, to communicate. So I don't see why there are still obstacles, to have stronger connections with these people.
And as we approach the end, I have to ask now a million euros or dollars question. How do you change the trend? How do you eradicate poverty and reduce inequality? And if there is a recipe, Sweden was mentioned, former Yugoslavia was mentioned, Slovenia was mentioned. If there are recipes, why aren't they in place? Both Belgrade and Pristina are on the EU track. Negotiating to become a member means also to open chapters that are that deal with issues like the labor laws, social issues, poverty, inequality. So how could our societies benefit from that EU process? And could that really help here?
Well, yes, you ask about the recipe. I don't think there is one recipe. You can see that, from these societies, different states in Asia that will also, they were very poor, but then each one of them choose some different path to success. Like some were more engaged in industry, others in services. China had their own, version of transition, so some mixture of capitalism and socialism until, 40 years, for 40 years more or less. So I don't think there is one recipe. Of course, we are on this EU track, but I don't think that the influence of European policies is the only influence. Like we've seen this, pandemia, we were all together in this terrible situation, so no matter where on earth we were at that time. So I think that, as before, these global influences will be felt here as well. So and there are some signs that things are changing in global economic policy, social policy, and I think that will be also felt here through, as before, through different international organizations, because it's interesting, EU was not very active in the social policy field in Serbia at the beginning of 2000. So World Bank, IMF were much more active. So it depends. So EU is not the only player. Of course, it will influence our path, but that's not the only one. So I expect this to be, some very, as I said, pandemia to be some turning point in the policy making.
Artem, back to you. How do you see what's the way out of this situation?
Well, I agree with Yelena that really there could be no ready-made prescription, but empirically looking, there are some policies that could contribute, to a better, more equal society. For example, I find that a minimal contributory pension, whatever changes in the pension systems are made, seems to be very, very important. Then national universal healthcare systems tend to be less costly and more supported by the people opinion. Public childcare seems to have better results everywhere where empirical studies show this. And I want to stress that, you know, if in a lot of empirical studies, equality is not, or more equality is really not, does not challenge growth or economic competition and so on, what are highly important for this region still. But going back to the question that you made, why don't we choose simply these policies that are proved to produce better results? The answer could be that these policies are not chosen by the parliament based on ideal consideration. They are fraught. They are they are results of political contestations. And in the case of Kosovo, as I said earlier, for 20 years, the right wing has been dominating the parliament, plus these international organizations, especially World Bank and IMF, has had really high influence. Nowadays, we have the first left-led majority in the parliament, and there are some signs that they want to move towards a more comprehensive social policy, towards more balanced social contract. But still, even there, you know, for those interested in internal Kosovo politics, they see that, you know, key people in the new government are still very much influenced, and they articulate these traditional mainstream right-wing ideas. So let's see.
What's the role of could the situation get better? Of course, the way forward is to strengthen your economy. And then to have better social policies. The region allegedly should get reorganized. Communities should close ranks in forming a kind of mini economic union in order to elevate competitiveness and to boost economies. Is there a place, Jelena, for regional? Those are words that we forgot. Regional solidarity in terms of manpower, in terms of labor rights, in terms of raising these issues, making these issues more obvious, putting these issues on agenda. How do you see the impact of a possible regional cooperation in that field?
I think personally that it's always better if you cooperate with your nearest neighbors, and if you have good relations, and if you are guided, you know, by economic interest rather than some political things. But unfortunately, I think when there are political problems, it's always, you know, stronger than economic interest. As you can, that was recently, I don't think it's even settled, the issue of high imports for some products from Serbia to Kosovo, which obviously is a bad policy for people living in Kosovo. Why do they need to pay, you know, higher prices for certain products? That's why I think it's better if we are guided by some economic interest, because there is at least, you know, most of the states in the Western Balkan region speak more or less the same language. So if you speak the same language and there is an opportunity, you know, for some educational cooperation, so we have lots of students coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro. I think it's a good thing. So, and that's the way how our societies are connected. So it's always a good thing to cooperate.
Artan, how do you see this regional moment? It was CEFTA once. It's now mini Schengen. The idea is to strengthen the economies, and that is believed to be the step one in eradicating poverty and inequality.
I don't know. I fully agree with what Yelena said earlier, and it's 100% sure that all these political complexities and so on have been limiting options for policy and economic development and so on and so on. I would just add to all these discussions that that really it amazes me that we are so much focused in these traditional now conflicts and so on that all the region, not only Kosovo and Serbia, have failed to address interests that are much bigger. You know, they have our region should start to discuss with EU about the huge regional inequalities. You know, one of the a part of negotiations with EU should really address these huge inequalities, you know, that are produced by structural policies, and this has not been part of debates, at least important debates in the recent months and years.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this discussion. It was really a pleasure hearing you both. For the followers, just to those who followed us, just to say that we had Jelena Žarković from the Faculty of Economics, University of Belgrade, and Artan Mustafa, Faculty of Political Science, University for Business and Technology from Pristina. I am very much looking forward to continuing this debate at the earliest possible opportunity. Artan, we are saying bye-bye, doviđenja from Belgrade. Thank you all, and this is the end of today's debate.